They say family is everything, but what happens when everything excludes you? This isn't the story of revenge. It's the story of remembering, of what we carry when no one notices, and what we become when no one claps. I wasn't the daughter they celebrated. I was the one who stayed quiet, while grief carved silence into my bones, and wedding bells drowned out mourning songs. But when the will was read, something changed. This is a story about absence, about being erased until the very thing they ignored became the thing they could never take credit for. They say grief comes in waves. For me, it came inside a cream-colored envelope. My name is Sophia. It was delivered on a dull Wednesday morning. I remember because I was still in pajamas sorting through a pile of unpaid bills and condolence letters leftovers from the week I buried my grandmother. My hands froze when I saw the elegant script, gold-embossed cursive on thick cardstock, my sister's name and her fiancé's. The honor of your presence is requested. Requested, as if my presence had ever been something they truly wanted. I set the invitation down and stared at the wall, not angry, not shocked, just hollow. The wedding was scheduled for the same weekend I had begged them to reserve for Grandma's memorial. The same weekend my father said, "It wouldn't be fair to your sister. She's waited her whole life for this." Fair. That word echoed like an insult. I had been there in the ICU holding Grandma's hand, when her heart monitor flattened into a steady line. I was the one who stayed awake through the nights, whispering stories, just to make her smile in her sleep. My sister didn't visit once. My parents sent a bouquet and an apology text. That was it. Still, I thought maybe they'd reconsider. Maybe they'd delay the wedding by a week, or even a few days. But when I called, Mom's voice was sharp. "Sweetheart, we've already paid the caterer. You know how stressful planning is for your sister. Let's not bring negativity into it." Negativity. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just stopped expecting anything from them. On the wedding day, I arrived wearing black. Not to protest, but because mourning doesn't schedule itself around cake tastings and flower arrangements. My dress was modest, my makeup subdued. I didn't smile much. People noticed. Aunt Sharon leaned in and whispered, "Try not to look so gloomy. This is a celebration." I wanted to remind her that Grandma raised me when my parents were too busy working overtime for my sister's tuition. That celebration comes in many forms, including remembrance. They took family portraits on the lawn. I stood off to the side, watching. At one point, Dad turned and looked at me. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He turned back toward the camera. I wasn't called over. When the photos were posted on Facebook a week later, I clicked through them out of habit. Every angle, every smile, every staged, candid moment. And not a single frame included me. Not one. I wasn't cropped out. I was never invited in. That night, I opened the last box Grandma had left for me. Inside was a small framed photo, her and me on the porch swing. I was maybe 12. She was laughing with her head thrown back, hand resting on my shoulder. Taped to the back was a note in her handwriting. "You always saw me as I was not as the family needed me to be. Thank you for being my mirror." I sat with that photo for an hour. I didn't cry, but something settled in me. Like a stone in a river finally finding its place. I had spent years trying to be visible to people who refused to see me, but Grandma had seen me, fully. And maybe that was enough. What I didn't know that night, what none of us knew, was that Grandma's real farewell hadn't happened yet. That story would be told not with flowers or speeches, but in ink and signatures. And when it came, it wouldn't need my parents' approval. It would be hers, entirely hers. The next morning, I received a voicemail from my mother. Her voice was bright, almost brittle. "Hi, honey, just checking in. Hope you're okay. We saw you at the wedding, well, sort of. You didn't stay long after the ceremony. Anyway, your sister was a bit upset you didn't come up for photos. Maybe next time. Love you." No mention of Grandma. No mention of the empty chair I had reserved for her at the back row of the reception. Just, "Maybe next time." I didn't call back. That Sunday I visited Grandma's grave. I brought peonies, her favorite, the kind she used to grow in the backyard. I sat cross-legged on the grass, rereading her note. "Thank you for being my mirror." The wind picked up. I could hear laughter in the distance. Families picnicking, children running. I wondered if they ever had to choose between mourning and pretending. I whispered. "They didn't even say your name, Grandma." The next few weeks blurred together. I buried myself in work. Teaching middle school wasn't glamorous, but at least it gave me structure, purpose. I started an after-school coding club, something Grandma always encouraged. "Use that smart brain of yours," she used to say. I thought about her every day. And then a letter arrived. Not from my parents, from a law firm. The envelope was thick, formal, addressed by hand. My heart pounded before I even opened it. Inside was a single sheet on letterhead and a handwritten note clipped to it. The letter explained that Grandma's will was entering probate, that I had been named as a primary beneficiary. The note was from her lawyer, Mr. Aldridge. It read, "She made several amendments last spring. She insisted on handwriting her reasons. We'll be in touch soon for the reading." Handwritten reasons. I stared at the page, stunned. Grandma had never talked much about money. She lived simply, crocheted her own blankets, used coupons, drove a 10-year-old sedan. But she'd also been wise, strategic, quietly powerful. The next day I called Mr. Aldridge. His tone was calm, warm. "Yes, she made changes shortly after your sister announced her engagement. She came in by herself." Very clear-headed, very determined. I asked what the amendments said. He hesitated. "It's best you hear it at the reading. Your parents and sister will be there." My stomach twisted. "They don't know, no." She requested confidentiality until the official proceedings. A week later, I received the date and time of the will reading. Same law office Grandma had used for decades. I didn't RSVP. I just showed up. When I walked into the conference room, my parents were already seated. My father stiffened. My mother blinked, surprised. My sister turned her head slightly, like seeing me was inconvenient. "Didn't expect you," Dad muttered. "I was invited," I replied calmly, sliding into a chair across from them. The lawyer entered, nodded, and began. He read the formalities first, her full name, the statement of sound mind, the standard legal phrasing. Then he paused and unfolded a handwritten page. "Before I read the disbursements, your mother wanted me to share her words." He cleared his throat. I held my breath. "If you're hearing this, I've already gone. And if you're surprised to see my handwriting, maybe that says more about you than about me." My sister scoffed quietly. Mom reached over to still her hand. "I've spent a long life watching how love is distributed in this family. Like a banquet where only certain plates are ever full. Some of you never noticed. Others never complained." Dad shifted in his seat. My pulse thundered. I wanted known that I saw who showed up when I needed help, who held my hand, who honored grief, not just celebration. There was a pause. Mr. Aldridge looked up, measuring the silence. Then he continued. "This isn't about punishment, it's about truth. And what we leave behind, not in money, but in memory." At that moment, something shifted in the room. The confident air my parents carried began to deflate. My sister's gaze fell to the table, and for the first time I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. When I was 7, I drew a picture of our family, Mom, Dad, my sister, and me. I remember coloring my dress yellow because Grandma always said yellow made me look like the sun. When I showed it to my parents, my mom smiled politely and said, "How sweet." Then she placed it under a stack of mail on the kitchen counter where it disappeared within the hour. My sister once drew a horse with glitter glue. They framed it and hung it in the hallway for years. That's the kind of childhood I had. Not abusive, not tragic. Just cold in quiet, measured ways. My parents adored my sister Lacey. From the moment she could recite the alphabet backwards, she was the bright one, the graceful one, the leader. She got ballet classes, summer camps, a private tutor for SAT prep. I got public school and the occasional hand-me-down. They didn't mean harm, I used to tell myself. It's just how things are. Some kids get noticed. Others learn to be useful. So I cooked, I cleaned. I stayed out of trouble, and when Grandma moved in after her stroke, I became her shadow. Not because I was told to, but because she saw me. She asked about my drawings. She saved them in a folder. She taught me how to make tea properly and how to fold bed sheets without a wrinkle. She said my silence was never empty. It just held more careful things. When I turned 16, Lacey was applying to Yale. My parents spent weekends touring campuses with her. I stayed behind to drive Grandma to physical therapy. When I graduated high school, there was no party. Lacey was moving to New Haven that weekend, and all attention went there. I didn't mind. By then, I'd learned not to expect anything. I had a quiet scholarship to the local state college, and I'd already found a part-time job at the campus library. Still, when Grandma handed me a wrapped box the night before I moved out, I almost cried. Inside was a second-hand laptop, nothing fancy, just enough to write papers and store files. But it was hers, paid in cash, saved from months of pension money. Use it to write something the world will remember, she said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. I nodded, unable to speak. College was manageable. I kept to myself, studied hard. Graduated early. No one from my family attended my commencement. Lacey's wedding planning had started that spring. My mother said, "We're so proud, sweetie, but there's just so much going on." I told her it was fine. When Lacey's invitations went out, mine arrived late. My name was misspelled. I wasn't part of the bridal party. Grandma had passed 3 weeks earlier, and her absence loomed like fog around everything. I still showed up, sat near the back, wore a dress she'd picked out with me the year before. When the photographer called family forward, no one asked me to join, so I stood alone just outside the frame, watching them smile beneath strings of fairy lights. Their laughter felt like glass clinking in another room. Later, I would scroll through the wedding album online, photo after photo of joy curated and glistening. I wasn't in a single shot, not even the wide ones. It was as if I had never been there at all. But I was there, just not where they ever bothered to look. In the weeks that followed the wedding, I didn't say much to anyone. My calls to my parents went unanswered. The few texts I sent, just check-ins, really were left on read. Lacey had flown off for her honeymoon in Santorini. I saw the pictures. Sun-kissed skin, flowing dresses, a ring that caught the Mediterranean light like it had something to prove. I didn't begrudge her joy. But somewhere inside me, something had grown quiet. Not bitter, not angry, just still. A kind of understanding had settled in, one that didn't need explanation. I wasn't part of their story. Not really. Then came the email from our family's attorney. It was formal, almost too polite. An invitation to attend a reading of our grandmother's will. It would be held at her lawyer's office downtown, the same place where I remembered sitting as a child, while she signed power of attorney papers, her hand steady, despite the tremors. The date was set for a Tuesday. I rearranged my work schedule, put on the one black dress I owned, and arrived early. The waiting room smelled like leather and lemon cleaner. The receptionist greeted me with a look of vague surprise, like she hadn't expected me to show. 10 minutes later, Lacey arrived in heels, too high for comfort, her husband trailing behind, tapping something on his phone. Our parents followed, all muted tones and tight smiles. We hadn't spoken since the wedding. The silence in the elevator ride to the 17th floor was deafening. The lawyer was an older man, white-haired and sharp-eyed, with a voice like gravel in a velvet bag. He greeted each of us by name. When he reached me, he paused just long enough to nod with respect. That alone caught my father's attention. We sat. The door closed. He began. The formalities came first, obligations, debts, funeral reimbursements, then the distributions, to my granddaughter Lacey. He read and listed several heirlooms, a string of pearls, a silver tea set, a collection of porcelain figurines. Pretty things, Instagrammable things. Lacey smiled. Her husband placed a hand on her knee. And to my granddaughter, who was not in the wedding album, he said next. Heads turned. My father blinked. My mother flinched. But who sat in the back row with grace and without resentment? Who poured tea for me when my hands could not hold the kettle, and who spoke softly when the world was too loud. I leave the following. There was a pause as he pulled out a second envelope, thicker, heavier. The deeds to my property in Vermont, my residual investments in health gen technologies, my annotated journals, and full rights to publish the memoir we worked on together for 5 years. The room tilted. I didn't react. I simply stared ahead, breathing evenly. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. My father sat very still. Lacey looked at me with something between confusion and betrayal, as though I'd taken something that belonged to her. But I hadn't taken anything. I had been given it, earned it, for years, quietly, patiently. The reading ended soon after. Polite goodbyes were offered. Some weren't returned. Outside on the sidewalk, the autumn air felt crisp and clean. I stood alone for a long minute, letting the cold settle into my lungs. The city moved around me, unaware, uncaring. But I knew something had shifted. Not just in inheritance, in gravity. For the first time, I was no longer orbiting someone else's life. I was the center of my own. In the weeks that followed the wedding, I didn't say much to anyone. My calls to my parents went unanswered. The few texts I sent, just check-ins, really were left unread. Lacey had flown off for her honeymoon in Santorini. I saw the pictures. Sun-kissed skin, flowing dresses, a ring that caught the Mediterranean light like it had something to prove. I didn't begrudge her joy, but somewhere inside me something had grown quiet. Not bitter, not angry, just still. A kind of understanding had settled in, one that didn't need explanation. I wasn't part of their story. Not really. Then came the email from our family's attorney. It was formal, almost too polite. An invitation to attend a reading of our grandmother's will. It would be held at her lawyer's office downtown, the same place where I remembered sitting as a child while she signed power of attorney papers, her hand steady despite the tremors. The date was set for a Tuesday. I rearranged my work schedule, put on the one black dress I owned, and arrived early. The waiting room smelled like leather and lemon cleaner. The receptionist greeted me with a look of vague surprise, like she hadn't expected me to show. 10 minutes later, Lacey arrived in heels too high for comfort, her husband trailing behind, tapping something on his phone. Our parents followed, all muted tones and tight smiles. We hadn't spoken since the wedding. The silence in the elevator ride to the 17th floor was deafening. The lawyer was an older man, white-haired and sharp-eyed, with a voice like gravel in a velvet bag. He greeted each of us by name. When he reached me, he paused just long enough to nod with respect. That alone caught my father's attention. We sat. The door closed. He began. The formalities came first: obligations, debts, funeral reimbursements. Then the distributions. To my granddaughter Lacey. He read and listed several heirlooms, a string of pearls, a silver tea set, a collection of porcelain figurines. Pretty things, Instagrammable things. Lacey smiled. Her husband placed a hand on her knee. And to my granddaughter, who was not in the wedding album, he said next. Heads turned. My father blinked. My mother flinched. But who sat in the back row with grace and without resentment? Who poured tea for me when my hands could not hold the kettle, and who spoke softly when the world was too loud? I leave the following. There was a pause as he pulled out a second envelope. Thicker, heavier. The deeds to my property in Vermont, my residual investments in health gen technologies, my annotated journals, and full rights to publish the memoir we worked on together for 5 years. The room tilted. I didn't react. I simply stared ahead, breathing evenly. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. My father sat very still. Lacey looked at me with something between confusion and betrayal, as though I'd taken something that belonged to her. But I hadn't taken anything. I had been given it, earned it, for years, quietly, patiently. The reading ended soon after. Polite goodbyes were offered. Some weren't returned. Outside on the sidewalk, the autumn air felt crisp and clean. I stood alone for a long minute, letting the cold settle into my lungs. The city moved around me, unaware, uncaring. But I knew something had shifted. Not just in inheritance, in gravity. For the first time, I was no longer orbiting someone else's life. I was the center of my own. The news of the will didn't stay quiet for long. By Thursday, my inbox held a series of emails from extended family. Some polite inquiries, others less so. My cousin Danny wrote, "Wow, you must have been really close to Grandma." None of us even knew she was writing a memoir. My uncle sent a single sentence, "Your parents are beside themselves." And then came the text from Lacey. They started soft. "Hey, can we talk?" Followed by, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." But there was no misunderstanding. There was only discomfort in facing a truth that had been ignored for too long. I had mattered to someone. Deeply. And she had chosen to make that clear when she no longer had to answer to anyone. It became harder to ignore when the local paper ran a small story in the human interest section. The title read, "Granddaughter to publish memoir of noted Vermont historian." There was a photo, an old one of me and my grandmother at a bookshop signing. I was 16, grinning, holding a stack of her essays. She was in her usual scarf, eyes crinkled with pride. I didn't post about it, didn't comment or share, but the people who needed to see it did. By Saturday, my mother called. I stared at her name on the screen for a while before answering. Her voice was tight, rehearsed. "You know, your father and I were surprised." I didn't say anything. She continued. "It's not that we ever meant to exclude you. The wedding, it was a lot. Lacey needed support, and I didn't. I asked." Silence. Then softly, "You've always been more independent." I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "That's what you call it." There was a pause. "Look, we just think maybe if there's a way you could redistribute some of what Grandma left. The property, for example. It's a lot for one person." I kept my tone even. She left what she wanted to leave. "I'm just following her wishes." "I understand," she said quickly. Too quickly. But she didn't understand, not really. She was only just beginning to grasp that her narrative, where I was the afterthought, the footnote, had been rewritten by someone with more clarity, more love. My father didn't call. Instead, he sent a letter, handwritten on the company stationery. The envelope smelled faintly of his cologne, sandalwood, and aftershave. The letter was formal, more business than sentiment. He wrote, "I trust you will manage the estate responsibly. This is, of course, a private family matter. We would appreciate it remaining that way. No mention of regret. No acknowledgement of the decades of dismissal." I placed the letter back in its envelope and filed it with the others from the attorney, the bank, the publishing house. A neat row of confirmations that the ground beneath my feet was no longer borrowed. At work, my colleagues asked questions in hushed tones. "So you're an heiress now," one joked. I laughed politely, but inside I didn't feel like an heiress. I felt like a survivor who'd been handed a pen and asked to write her own ending. And that ending wasn't revenge. It wasn't public humiliation or family shaming. It was clarity. I started drafting the final chapters of the memoir. My grandmother's handwriting, tucked between the margins of typed pages, guided me. Notes like, "Don't forget the lilac tree. You loved it." Or describe the way silence felt after your visits, like something sacred. She had known, all along. And now the world would know too. The envelope was ivory with gold embossing, elegant, tasteful, and completely disingenuous. It arrived on a Monday, slipped under my apartment door with no return address. I opened it slowly, already guessing what it would say. Inside was a card, thick and perfumed, printed with cursive script that read, "You're invited to a celebration of family unity." Below it, in smaller font, hosted by Lacey and Jonathan. RSVP requested. There was no mention of the will. No acknowledgement of my grandmother. No note scribbled by hand from my sister. Just a sterile message on glossy paper asking me to come smile for the cameras. A celebration of unity. Funny how unity only matters when there's something to lose. I placed the card on my kitchen counter and stared at it while my tea cooled. The RSVP email was listed as laceyandjonathanforeverajmail.com. Even the address felt performative. 2 days later, Lacey called. "Hey," she chirped. "Did you get the invite I did?" There was a pause. I really hope you'll come. It's going to be small. Just family. We thought it might be good, for optics. There it was. Not for healing, not for truth. For optics. I'm not a prop, Lacey. Her tone shifted. No one's saying that. We just thought after everything it might be nice to put differences aside. For Mom and Dad. For Mom and Dad, I repeated. The ones who asked me to split what Grandma left me because it was too much for one person, she sighed. You're still upset? No, I'm clear. There's a difference. A longer silence this time. I just think it's time we move forward. Move forward. Another phrase people use when they don't want to look back. I didn't respond. Just waited. Lacey, sensing the silence stretch too long, continued. People are asking questions. About the will. About why you were left everything. I'm just saying it'd help if we were seen together. A photo, a few smiles. I felt something cold move through me. Lacey, I said quietly, do you even remember the last conversation I had with Grandma? What she told me not to let them define me. That sometimes the strongest statement is made not with noise, but with presence. Or absence. Lacey said nothing. I ended the call without saying goodbye. That Friday I walked through the park behind my building, the autumn wind tugging gently at the hem of my coat. I watched a father lift his daughter onto his shoulders so she could reach the last red leaf on a tree. She laughed as it floated to the ground. It hit me then how many moments had been stolen from me not just through action, but through omission. Through being constantly told to step aside, to lower my expectations, to understand that some people just need more. That had always been the justification. Lacey was sensitive. Lacey was the golden child. Lacey was the investment. And me, I was the stable one. The one who didn't need help. But maybe I had. And maybe they just never asked. That weekend, I didn't attend the party. Instead, I visited my grandmother's old house, now legally mine. The mailbox still bore her maiden name in fading stencil Winslow. I ran my fingers over it like it might speak. Inside, I opened her cedar chest and found photo albums, years of birthdays, holidays, family vacations. In everyone, I noticed a pattern. I was present but never centered. Always on the edge of the frame or missing entirely, until the last album. It was newer. Just 6 pages. Every picture was of me and her cooking, reading, walking by the lake. Each one carefully dated, captioned in her delicate handwriting. And on the inside cover, a note for the one who saw me not as a role to play, but as a person to love. This, my darling, is your proof. You are always the story worth telling. It started with a blog post, not a viral tweet, not a headline. Just a quiet blog written by an old friend of Grandma Winslow's, someone who had known her since her teaching days. The post was titled, Who She Really Was. Eleanor Winslow, Beyond the Estate. It wasn't malicious, just observant. The author wrote about how Eleanor had become distant from her children in recent years, how she spoke of unspoken wounds and second chances. She wrote about a quiet afternoon they'd shared 6 months before Grandma's passing, where Eleanor mentioned rewriting her will for the sake of justice. The article was picked up by a local community newsletter, then somehow by a regional human interest blog. Within 2 weeks, it had over 40,000 shares. Suddenly, there were whispers. Why did the Winslow family's matriarch leave everything to her second-born? Why wasn't the elder daughter married into wealth, politically connected, mentioned in the new documents at all? And why did the original will vanish quietly, replaced by one drafted 3 weeks before Eleanor's passing? I hadn't spoken to the press. Not once, but someone did. And it wasn't me. A tabloid-style website released a piece featuring anonymous quotes from a close family source, claiming that the younger daughter had manipulated Eleanor during her final days. It painted me as opportunistic, calculating. She always resented her sister, one line read. I read the article in silence, sitting at the same oak table where Grandma had taught me how to do taxes when I was 16. She used to say, knowledge is power. Most people lose money not because they don't have it, but because they don't understand it. I remembered every word. 3 days after the article went live, I received a letter, not an email, but a certified document. It was from the law firm that had managed Grandma's estate. The letter was brief. Due to multiple inquiries and mounting public pressure, our office has been instructed by the court to schedule a formal review of the revised will effective immediately. You are advised to secure legal representation. I folded the paper carefully, placed it back in its envelope, and breathed in. There was no panic, only clarity. The next morning, I called a lawyer I had met during one of Grandma's community workshops, a woman named Ava Grant Sharp and respected in elder law circles. When I told her the situation, she simply said, "I read the blog. I was waiting for your call." We met over tea. I brought every document. I had original emails, health directives signed by Grandma, even the journals she kept in her final year. Ava reviewed them in silence. Then she looked up and said, "They don't realize this isn't a fight for inheritance. It's a fight for her voice to be heard." And she was right. At the same time, invitations started disappearing. People who once lined up to toast Lacey at fundraising events were backing away. Her glossy image was cracking, not because I said a word, but because the story no longer made sense. Too many people had met Grandma. Too many had seen me pushing her wheelchair through the park, waiting outside her appointments, picking up prescriptions, staying late to fix her thermostat. These weren't staged photos for social media. They were real moments, witnessed, remembered. The legal review was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, my parents called twice, left voicemails, both vague. "Let's talk about this calmly. You don't have to go through with it. Think of the family. Think of the family." I had. For 30 years. I didn't respond. Instead, I went through Grandma's files and found the original will voided and replaced, but still filed. I compared it to the new one. Every change was highlighted. Every explanation recorded in her own handwriting. And taped to the final page, a note. To those who ask why, remember, silence is not always consent. Sometimes it's preparation. The courtroom wasn't grand. It was modest, tucked into a corner of the county civic center. Beige walls, flickering overhead lights, a faint smell of paper and old coffee. But to me it felt heavier than any cathedral. A handful of people sat in the pew-like benches, journalists with notepads, 1 or 2 neighbors, and unmistakably Lacey and my parents. They sat together, not as 3 individuals, but as one solid front. Lacey's hair was pulled into a severe bun, her jacket pressed to perfection. My father's tie matched hers. My mother's hands were clasped tight, white-knuckled around a small leather clutch I recognized from years ago. They didn't look around the room, didn't glance my way, just stared straight ahead as if pretending this wasn't about me at all. But it was. The judge entered efficient, no nonsense, no fanfare. Papers were shuffled, names were called, and then the hearing began. Their lawyer spoke first. He painted a portrait, a grieving family shocked by a sudden and suspicious change in Eleanor Winslow's final wishes. He questioned her mental capacity, suggested undue influence, even mentioned the blog post, implying that my recent notoriety had fueled this so-called drama. It was clinical, cold, almost rehearsed. And then Ava stood up. She didn't pace, she didn't raise her voice, she simply placed a stack of folders on the table and said, "We ask that the court review the following, a notarized video of the testator reading her revised will, her signed journals, and a digital footprint of legal consultations made independently over the course of 11 months. She handed over copies, her voice steady. The room shifted. The judge raised an eyebrow, asked for clarification. Ava explained everything, dates, witnesses, medical evaluations, even Eleanor's own handwriting confirming her intentions. When the video played, the courtroom fell silent. There was Grandma Eleanor seated in her favorite armchair, her voice firm. "I am of sound mind," she said. "I am making this decision after long consideration. This is not about love. This is about fairness. One daughter visited. One didn't. One listened. The other performed. I am tired of performance." No one breathed. The judge paused the video halfway through, turned to Lacey's lawyer. Do you have a rebuttal? They didn't. Not really. They tried to discredit the timestamp, question the tech integrity. But Ava was ready. Every technical detail had been pre-verified. The notary had passed a sworn affidavit. Even the date metadata had been certified by a third party. Lacey's face didn't change, but my father looked away for the first time. My mother blinked slow, long, and finally looked at me. Not with anger, not with sorrow, with something closer to confusion, as if the version of me she had constructed for decades was suddenly unfamiliar. The court ruled in my favor. They upheld the revised will. There was no cheer, no gasp, just a formal acknowledgement, a gavel's tap, and the slow shuffling of feet as everyone began to rise. Outside the courtroom, the press had gathered. Not a mob, but enough to block the exit with questions. Why do you think she changed the will? What's your response to your family's allegations? Are you going to keep the entire estate? I didn't answer. I walked past them down the steps through the fall air. Each leaf crunch underfoot felt like a punctuation mark in a sentence I had been writing since childhood. A statement, not a question. I passed by a reflection in the courthouse window, my own, but also not. Older, straighter, quieter, someone I had become while no one was watching. That night I didn't celebrate. I went home, made tea, pulled out Grandma's old journals, the ones she'd hidden in the sewing cabinet, read them cover to cover. In one entry dated 8 months before her death, she had written, I don't regret the choices I made, only the time it took me to make them. The call came the day after the ruling. Ava's voice was calm but urgent. There's something we didn't see before, she said. It's about the will, something tucked into the supplementary materials. You need to come in. I arrived at her office just before dusk. The city outside was glowing in that golden hour way, soft and deceitful. Like nothing important could ever happen beneath such light. But inside, the air was heavy. Ava didn't offer small talk. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a scanned page, handwritten in a neat, deliberate script. It was part of a sealed addendum, she explained. Your grandmother added it 3 weeks before she passed. She asked it only be read if the primary terms of the will were challenged. I scanned the page. My grandmother's voice echoed in every word. If you're reading this, then the people I feared might be disappointed. That means they tried to take what wasn't nurtured by their own hands. And so I ask one more thing. My heart pounded. I hereby transfer not only my estate, but my name, my legacy, to the one person who chose love over performance. She built presence, not pretense. My last request is that Eleanor Winslow be more than a signature on paper. Let her name live on in something meaningful. Ava flipped to the next page. There, typed and notarized, was a clause activating a fund. The Winslow Fellowship, a $1.2 million endowment in my name for daughters, estranged by favoritism to help them return to education or restart their lives. I didn't speak. Couldn't. It was as if my grandmother had cut through time itself, anticipating the very wound they would try to reopen. And instead of leaving me money, she'd left me purpose. Are you all right? Ava asked gently. I nodded, but something in me cracked, not from pain, but from a quiet kind of healing I hadn't expected. For so long, I had moved in silence shaped by absence. But here was proof that someone had seen me, completely. We issued a press release about the fellowship 2 days later, not out of pettiness, but transparency. The story spread faster than I expected, first local news, then national blogs. The headline read, Estranged Granddaughter Turns Inheritance into National Fund for Forgotten Daughters. At first I avoided the comments, but curiosity broke me. And there, buried beneath the noise, were voices I hadn't known were waiting. One said, My sister got everything when Dad died. I thought I was alone. Another wrote, Thank you for reminding us that legacy isn't about money. It's about who remembers you when the room empties. A week later, I received a letter. Handwritten, no return address. But the handwriting was familiar. My mother, I don't expect forgiveness. and I still don't understand it all. But I watched the hearing and the video. You look like her. You spoke like her. Maybe that's what scared me. I hope you'll use this name well. It wasn't an apology, not fully. But it was something, and yet I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because I had finally understood closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's a decision to continue. A month after the court ruling, I stood at the front of a university auditorium, quiet, steady. No cameras, no reporters. Just a small crowd of women, ages 25 to 55, seated with forms in their laps. They were the first applicants for the Winslow Fellowship. I looked at them not as a victor, not as someone who'd won a fight, but as someone who'd emerged with something far rarer than vindication: peace. And in that peace, a mission: to take what was left for me and make sure it never ends with me. It didn't take long for the news to reach them. Within 48 hours of the press release about the Winslow Fellowship, my parents' neighborhood WhatsApp group was buzzing. Quietly at first, then with visible intensity. Screenshots were shared, links forwarded. There was no scandal, no accusation. Just a headline, a face, and a name: mine. A name they had spent years distancing themselves from. At the grocery store, my mother was approached by someone from her church. "Did you see the story?" they asked gently. "Your daughter's done something remarkable." She had nodded, smiled even. But her hands shook when she picked up the tomatoes. My father's co-workers didn't ask. They sent a single email with a link and the subject line: respect. And my sister Jessica, she called our mother the next night. No greetings, no pleasantries. "Why didn't you tell me she built something?" My mother's silence stretched through the phone line. Then, almost in a whisper, "We didn't know." Jessica had been the one with wedding photos on every wall, degrees framed, and celebrated gifts wrapped in expensive paper. I had only ever asked for space, for presents, and even that too was always half given. Now the daughter they thought would fade had cast a longer shadow than they could have imagined. In private, my father sat at the kitchen table with the morning paper. My name again on the second page this time. Not about the inheritance, but a quote from a woman who had just received funding from the Winslow Fellowship. It gave me a reason to believe again, to study again, to finally think my life isn't over. He didn't finish his coffee that day, just folded the paper and walked upstairs. They didn't call, not yet, but they started looking at each other differently. Not in anger, but in an unfamiliar quiet, a shared discomfort. As if they had collectively misplaced something precious, and weren't sure where or when it had slipped away. At church that Sunday, their usual pew was emptier. Not because others had left, but because attention had shifted. Kind glances became curious ones. Some offered congratulations, others simply said nothing at all. And still no one mentioned Jessica's wedding. There were no Facebook albums shared, no honeymoon updates. The joy they had so carefully orchestrated had been drowned in something they didn't understand: relevance earned, not inherited. My grandmother's voice, posthumously amplified, was now reshaping the family narrative. She had always been quiet, but in death she had spoken louder than all of them combined. The hardest part, perhaps, was not the estate or the money. It was that my parents could no longer claim ignorance. Every article, every quote, every praise, they were witnesses to a life they had refused to see. And that more than anything burned. Jessica, to her credit, reached out. An email. "I didn't know what you were carrying. I didn't try to know. I'm sorry. I still don't understand everything, but I hope one day we can talk." I read it twice, then closed my laptop, because forgiveness isn't a transaction. It is an ode. It's earned slowly, quietly in the spaces where silence once lived. And as for my parents, they sent no letter, no call. But Ava, my lawyer, forwarded a message she'd received on my behalf. "We would like to donate privately to the Winslow Fellowship Fund. Please let us know how to proceed. No names, no attention, just contribution." It was signed Mr. and Mrs. Winslow. I didn't respond. Because peace doesn't require confirmation. Nor does healing wait for permission. They had once taught me that presence was conditional. Now I had shown them that presence, real unwavering presence, was what they'd been missing all along. I didn't reply to their message. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't know what to say that wouldn't unravel the piece I had stitched together thread by thread. Instead, I took a walk. It had become a quiet ritual. Just before dusk, when the streets softened and the sky turned lavender, I'd pass by the same bakery with the flickering neon sign, the florist who watered her window plants, like they were family, and the bus stop, where old men still played chess, never speaking, only nodding. This was the world I had rebuilt, not one crafted from noise or applause, but one carefully formed by solitude and tension, and small, consistent acts of dignity. I moved to a modest brownstone a few blocks from the Winslow Foundation's new satellite office. The walls were bare at first, but slowly they collected meaning: a photograph of my grandmother in her youth, an award plaque from a local tech initiative, a handmade thank you card from a scholarship recipient. These things spoke louder than inheritance ever could. Ava, my lawyer, met me one morning over coffee. "They've made the donation," she said, anonymously, but sizable. "It'll cover next year's expansion into underserved counties." I stirred my drink slowly. "Good," I said. Because while apology is powerful, action is what rewrites legacy. The press had moved on, of course. Fame is a passing tide. But purpose, if rooted deep enough, doesn't need headlines to grow. In a quiet moment that week, I visited a community center where Code 4 Care had just been installed. An elderly man with Parkinson's was learning to use it, his granddaughter guiding his fingers. "It reminds him to take his meds," she said, smiling. "And it calls me if he forgets." I nodded, watching the screen light up with gentle prompts. Not every victory needs an audience. That night, I returned home and reread Jessica's email. "I hope one day we can talk." I clicked reply and let my fingers hover over the keys. Then I typed, "Not yet, but someday." Closure, I'd come to learn, isn't a finish line. It's a process, a rhythm, a rebalancing. And while the old version of me would have waited for approval, for praise, for love freely given, I no longer needed those things to define myself. Instead, I began writing letters, not to my family, but to the girls like me, the ones who bore silence like armor, who sat at tables where their presence was tolerated but never truly seen. I started a mentorship circle, small at first, 3 girls from community colleges. We'd meet every month, not to talk about grades or goals, but about grit, about grief, about growth. They didn't know my full story. They didn't need to. They only needed to know that someone who had been overlooked could still become something enduring. In December, a letter arrived. Handwritten, no return address, but the penmanship was familiar. It read, "We can't undo what we did not see. But we see now. We see you." I placed it in a drawer beneath my grandmother's last letter. Both were written too late, but both in their own way closed a chapter. That Christmas, I didn't go home. Instead, I spent the day delivering care kits to seniors alone in assisted living homes. I left one on a doorstep, where I saw no wreath, no light, no sign of visitors. Inside the kit was a blanket, a book, and a note. "You are remembered, because perhaps that is the final quiet revenge against a life that tried to erase you. To remember others even when you weren't remembered." Legacy, I learned, isn't what they write about you in headlines. It's not in the applause that fades or the certificates framed on a wall. It's in the choices you make when no one's watching and the ripples those choices leave behind. The month after the letter arrived, I found myself waking up earlier, not out of anxiety or habit, but something gentler, like stillness had finally taken root inside me. The sun filtering through the blinds didn't feel so harsh anymore. The silence in the apartment didn't press down on me, it held me. Softly, I made tea, not coffee. I wore sweaters that felt like a hug. I answered emails not with urgency, but with care. And every Wednesday morning, I went back to the community tech lab, where it all began, before the grants, before the foundation, before the speeches. I sat quietly in the back of the room and helped teenagers debug code. I didn't introduce myself with a title. I didn't need to. They just called me Miss Elaine, thinking I was someone's aunt or teacher who liked helping out. That was enough. One afternoon, a boy stayed behind after the workshop. He'd built a prototype of a voice-activated system for his visually impaired grandfather. "It's not perfect," he said, shoulders hunched. "It doesn't need to be," I replied. "It needs to be real." His eyes lit up, not because I praised him, but because I saw him, and I remembered what it felt like to be seen. At the foundation gala later that winter, I sat at the very edge of the banquet hall. The chair beside me remained empty all evening. The donors shook hands. Cameras flashed. The new director gave a speech about growth expansion in the future. My name was barely mentioned, but I didn't mind. Because every initiative they announced, the mobile health units, the intergenerational tech bridge, the senior mentorship grants, had come from a seed I had quietly planted. I smiled to myself, not a smug smile, a knowing one. When the event ended, a young woman approached. She looked no older than 21, nervous but determined. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, eyes wet but steady. "I started studying health tech because of a video about Code for Care. My grandma uses it every day." I nodded. I didn't ask her name. I just said, "Then you'll make something better than I ever did." And when you do teach someone else, legacy is not keeping your name in lights. It's passing your flame on before it burns out. In the spring, I returned to the lake house. It had been transferred to me in the revised will, along with the last of my parents' estate. The place had sat untouched for almost a year. The grass had grown wild. Ivy curled along the deck. The paint chipped along the window panes. But the air was the same, crisp, clean, unforgiving. I spent 3 days there, alone, no calls, no laptop. I walked barefoot on the dock. I cooked one-person meals. I stood in the living room where years ago I was told to let it go when I asked why my grief was inconvenient. On the third night, I took out a sheet of paper and wrote 3 names: my parents, my sister, myself. Then I drew a line through the first 2, not out of spite, out of release. I burned the page, watching the edges curl, blacken, and dissolve into nothing. Some inheritances come in the form of property and stock portfolios. Mine came in the form of space. Space to rebuild, not in reaction to what was lost, but in alignment with what could finally be. The next morning, I locked the lake house, left the key under a stone, walked away. Because legacy isn't something you wait for others to write. It's something you live quietly every time you choose dignity over noise, peace over performance, and purpose over pain. It had been 3 weeks since the lake house. 3 weeks since I burned that piece of paper with our names on it. 3 weeks since I allowed silence to mean peace instead of punishment. Then came the letter. It arrived in a thick envelope, the kind printed on cream cardstock, no logo, no return address, just my name in an elegant serif font. Inside, the legal firm informed me that the estate settlement was complete, but there was more. Enclosed was a personal letter, handwritten by my father. I stared at the penmanship, crisp, yet unfamiliar. He'd written in cursive I hadn't seen since childhood. Every loop and line felt distant, like it belonged to another man. It read, "If you're reading this, I'm no longer here to explain myself. I wish I had been better at saying the right things, or at least staying quiet when I didn't know what to say. But I failed at both, especially when you needed me most. I let grief twist into discomfort. I watched your pain and chose convenience. I saw your strength and called it cold. I saw your silence and called it stubborn. And worst of all, I stood behind your mother when she called your mourning a disruption. I didn't stop her. By then, we were too far down the road of favorites and omissions. I thought your sister's wedding needed a celebration, not your sorrow. I was wrong. That's not what a father does. I've made arrangements to give you the family assets, not as a reward, but as a correction. I don't expect forgiveness, just that you use it to build something better, You were always building, even when we weren't looking. No signature, just a date. I didn't cry, not because it didn't matter, but because it had arrived too late to fix what had already been dismantled, but just in time to cement what I'd rebuilt without them. The next day I sat with my lawyer. I asked him to set up a fund using part of the estate not for me, but for students like me. Ones who weren't the chosen children. Ones who coded in cafes between shifts. Ones who skipped weddings to stay afloat. Ones who turned pain into projects, not noise. We named it the Unseen Foundation. The first round of grants went out 3 months later. I never attended the ceremonies. I didn't need to. Each letter from a recipient scanned and emailed felt like a whispered echo from a life I once lived. No one in my family believed I could finish school, but now I'm opening a clinic in our neighborhood. I didn't tell anyone I applied because I was afraid I'd fail. But you believed in me. My parents said this path wouldn't lead to anything. Now I'm building software to support elder care. They didn't know who I was. The applications were blind, but I knew them. I recognized every syllable of their stories. One evening, I was invited to a dinner at a community center funded by the foundation. I almost didn't go, but something nudged me there. In a quiet corner of the room, a girl stood next to a display board of her capstone project. She couldn't have been more than 19. The title read, Redesigning Care Tech for Dignity, Not Just Efficiency. She explained it with the poise of someone who had been overlooked but not broken. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice didn't. I asked her why she chose this project. She shrugged. Because my grandmother deserved better than an alarm that beeped. She deserved a voice that sounded like family. That was it. Legacy. Not an inheritance of furniture or lake houses or even stock options, but dignity passed forward. That night, as I walked out under the soft glow of community center lights, I realized something I hadn't put into words until then. What my parents withheld from me in love, they unknowingly gifted me in clarity. And from that clarity, I built a life of substance. Quiet but unshakable. And in the quiet, I finally heard what I had waited years to hear. Not an apology, but purpose. The next time someone asks why I didn't invite my parents to the foundation's anniversary, I'll tell them the truth. Because this story was never about reconciliation. It was about recognition. Not of me, but of people like me. Quiet builders, silent healers, invisible shoulders that carried weight no one applauded. The auditorium was packed. No spotlight, no stage. Just rows of chairs filled with people who once thought they were alone. The screen at the front played a short film made by one of our grant recipients. It showed elderly neighbors smiling as university volunteers checked blood pressure, replaced batteries and care devices, and perhaps most importantly, stayed to talk. No one left early. Not a single phone glowed in distraction. In the final scene, a frail woman clasped a volunteer's hand and said, "I didn't know people still remembered us." That line stayed in the room like perfume, unspoken but lingering. After the event, a man in his 60s approached me. His name tag read, Volunteer Lead, Detroit. I just wanted to say, he began, clearing his throat, that you didn't just create a program, you created a reason for some of us to wake up again. I didn't respond with a speech. I just nodded. Because sometimes the loudest acknowledgments are the quietest ones. Later that night, I sat alone in my apartment. No awards on the walls, just books, plants, and silence. And I thought about the word legacy again. So many think it's what's left behind. But I've learned that legacy can also be what we start, without needing applause. I clicked open the admin dashboard for the Unseen Foundation. A new batch of applications had just come in. Some of the names looked familiar, not because I knew them, but because I knew the pattern. A student from rural Minnesota, whose essay talked about sleeping in the public library between shifts. A single mother in Georgia, building an app for affordable childcare. A nursing student in Arizona whose brother has cerebral palsy. Her dream was to make medical forms accessible for nonverbal patients. Every one of them carried a silent weight. And every one of them was ready to turn that weight into worth. That's the thing no one tells you about being unseen. When you finally find your footing, your path doesn't end at proving others wrong. It begins at proving someone else right. And maybe, just maybe, that someone is the next version of you. So if you're watching this and your story sounds like mine, if you were the afterthought at family dinners, if your grief was deemed inconvenient, if you've ever been told your dreams were nice but not realistic, or if you've quietly built something in the background while the spotlight pointed elsewhere, then this is not just a story. It's a mirror, and here's what I want you to see in it. Your silence is not weakness. Your persistence is not invisible. Your grief is not a burden. Your work, even when uncelebrated, is still holy, and your voice, even if quiet, carries farther than you think. So build, write, code, care, fight smart. Let dignity be your legacy. Let purpose be your reply. And if they ever ask you who helped you get there, it's okay to say no one. At first, but eventually, I did. And if you ever find yourself standing on a stage, or maybe just in a room full of people finally listening, don't scream to be heard. Speak to be remembered, because you will be. I never needed the spotlight. I only needed the space to build my own, and now I pass that space on to the ones who were overlooked, to the ones who built in silence, to the ones who've been told you're not the chosen one. Because being chosen, that's not what defines legacy. Choosing yourself does. If this story sounded familiar, it's because it was never just mine. It belongs to anyone who's ever whispered in a world that only listened to noise. Let your quiet carry far.